The mansion loomed over the city like a fortress, dark and unwelcoming, every corner polished yet cold. Inside, the air was heavy with discipline and fear, and every step echoed like a warning. In the heart of this intimidating world, a man sat in a massive leather chair, his presence alone enough to silence the room. He was the Mafia boss, known for his ruthlessness and sharp temper, a man whose reputation made even his closest allies tread lightly. Yet today, even his iron composure seemed fragile, for in the ornate cradle nearby lay a new life, his newborn child. The baby was small and fragile, wrapped tightly in soft blankets, yet every little movement seemed to echo through the mansion, as though it carried more weight than it should. The child's eyes, wide and searching, seemed to study everyone in the room, instinctively wary of every touch, every hand that reached too close. Even the staff, trained to handle fear and danger, hesitated before approaching. Whispers passed silently among the servants. The child cries violently, thrashes at anyone who tries to hold them, and refuses comfort. The boss's own gaze rarely left the cradle. He leaned forward, his dark eyes sharp, his jaw tight, and his hands resting on the arms of his chair, knuckles white. There was a strange tension in him, one that none of his associates had ever seen. This tiny being, so small and defenseless, seemed to hold a power over him that no rival, no money, and no threat ever had. Around the mansion, the staff moved cautiously, their actions measured, careful not to provoke the baby's wrath. Nannies and guards alike had been warned, yet each one had failed to soothe the infant. Every failed attempt left behind trembling hands, anxious whispers, and a growing sense of unease. The distance between the baby and the world around it was stark, emotional and physical. In this house of fear, the newborn had already claimed its space, setting the rules silently. No one could touch without consequence, and the Mafia boss, for the first time in his life, felt powerless to change it. The cry began softly at first, a whimper that could have been mistaken for hunger or discomfort, but within moments it escalated into a high-pitched, relentless wail that pierced the silence of the mansion like a warning siren. Every corner of the grand house seemed to tremble with the sound. The servants froze, the polished floors reflecting their wide-eyed fear, and the guards shifted uneasily, unsure where to focus their attention. Even the chandeliers above seemed to quiver with the vibration of the baby's incessant crying. The Mafia boss, seated in his imposing chair, clenched his fists. His dark eyes narrowed, scanning the room as if willing the noise to stop through sheer force. He was used to controlling people, situations, and even fear itself. But this tiny being defied all of it. Each cry cut through his patience like a blade, stirring a rare frustration he had never experienced. He rose from his seat, the floor creaking under his weight, and his voice rang sharp, commanding yet powerless. "Silence it, now." The nannies and maids tried. They approached with soft whispers, gentle rocking, and warm bottles, their movements careful and precise. But the baby recoiled from every touch, thrashing and screaming with an intensity that made the adults step back in panic. Even the guards, strong and fearless men who had faced violence without blinking, found themselves hesitant to intervene. Their hands shook as they tried to pick up the infant, only to be met with furious wails that pierced their eardrums and left them flustered. The mansion, once a place of rigid order and fear for outsiders, had become a place ruled by this small, defiant life. Hallways that normally echoed with obedience and discipline now resonated with the baby's screams, a sound so pure yet so commanding it left the entire household on edge. The Mafia boss paced, jaw tight, frustration bubbling into helplessness. No strategy, no authority, and no wealth could tame the unrelenting cries. In that moment, the tiny, fragile child wielded a power unmatched by anything else in the boss's life, and for the first time, everyone realized that fear could exist in both directions. The baby feared no one, and the mansion feared the baby. The nurse arrived quietly, her shoes making no sound on the marble floors, a stark contrast to the tension that filled the mansion. She was young, barely out of her teens, with simple clothes and hands that had known hard work. Her face was soft, kind, and unassuming, carrying a warmth that immediately set her apart from the cold, polished rigidity of the household staff. She had grown up in poverty, learning patience, empathy, and resilience from a life where every small act of care mattered. The head nurse greeted her with a skeptical frown. "This isn't a nursery for ordinary children," she said, her tone sharp. "If you can't handle the baby, don't bother trying." But the young nurse didn't flinch. She simply nodded, her calm composure quietly asserting itself. She had worked in overcrowded hospitals where babies cried endlessly, where exhausted parents watched helplessly, and she had learned that fear could be soothed only with gentleness and understanding. As she approached the cradle, the baby's cries erupted again, louder than ever. The staff hesitated, but she stepped forward slowly, crouching beside the infant without rushing or forcing contact. She spoke softly, almost in a whisper, letting the baby hear her steady, warm voice. Unlike others, she didn't try to impose control. Instead, she watched, observed, and waited, her eyes attentive to every flicker of the baby's expression. For the first time, someone in the mansion wasn't reacting with fear or frustration. She noticed that the baby's cries spiked with tension, calmed slightly with gentleness, and responded to her patient, deliberate approach. The contrast between her soft presence and the cold, harsh environment of the mansion was stark. While the staff had failed, she seemed to understand something subtle, something essential about the child that nobody else had yet seen. A tiny hint of hope that perhaps the unsoothable could be reached. The nurse gently picked up the baby, cradling the tiny body against her chest with a tenderness that immediately caught the eye of anyone watching. She rocked slowly, humming a soft tune she had learned in the hospital, hoping the familiar rhythm would comfort the infant. But the baby's wails only grew louder, shrill and unrelenting, shaking the room with every cry. She tried adjusting the blanket, checking the diaper, and offering a bottle. Nothing worked. The infant twisted, arched, and screamed, rejecting every attempt at care. Around her, the staff shifted uncomfortably. Nannies whispered among themselves, exchanging worried glances. Even the guards, strong and fearless, flinched at the intensity of the cries. The mansion, usually filled with cold order and precision, felt chaotic, almost helpless. The baby had turned the environment upside down, and every failed attempt seemed to magnify the tension. In the shadows, the Mafia boss leaned against the edge of the polished staircase, his dark eyes fixed on the scene. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of frustration, curiosity, and an odd, unspoken impatience. He had seen countless failures in his life, but none had rattled him like this. He said nothing, letting the nurse work, though the tension radiating from him was unmistakable. Yet the nurse remained calm. She didn't scold the baby, didn't show impatience, and didn't rush. Every failed attempt was met with a soft sigh, a gentle adjustment, and a quiet reassurance to the infant. Her hands were steady, her voice soothing, her movements deliberate. Even in the face of repeated rejection, her compassion never faltered. She had learned that fear, anger, or frustration only made a frightened child cry louder. Slowly, silently, she studied the baby, noting the tiny reactions, the flickers of comfort amidst the terror, preparing herself for the breakthrough that she knew would come. If only she could understand what the baby truly needed. The nurse settled into a quiet rhythm, spending hours beside the cradle, observing rather than forcing. Every movement of the baby, every subtle change in expression, every pause in the cries became a clue she carefully recorded in her mind. Unlike the others, who responded to the crying with fear, frustration, or anger, she noticed how the infant's reactions were different depending on the energy in the room. The baby recoiled from sharp voices, sudden movements, and tense gestures, thrashing violently at anyone who approached aggressively. Yet when approached with gentleness, patience, and warmth, the cries softened slightly, even if only for a moment. She began to recognize patterns in the cries. Certain pitches indicated hunger or discomfort, but others were tied to fear. Fear of the world, of unfamiliar hands, of strangers whose presence carried authority or tension. In those moments, the baby's wide eyes would dart around the room, tracking each movement, each shadow, as though analyzing the threat before deciding whether to surrender or resist. The nurse understood that this child was not unruly or spoiled. The baby had survived a world of instinctual caution, a tiny being trained to protect itself with every wail and flail. Her observations extended to tiny gestures, the subtle twitch of a finger, the arching of a back, the flicker of lips. Each micro-expression told a story of trust or fear, curiosity or caution. She realized that patience alone would not suffice. She needed to align her presence with the baby's sense of safety. The nurse adjusted her tone, her speed, and even her breathing to mirror calmness, offering an energy the infant could trust. Slowly, a bond began to form, invisible but undeniable. The baby's cries became less frantic when the nurse was near. The staff noticed it too, a subtle shift in tension, though they didn't understand why. The nurse alone had deciphered what everyone else had missed. This infant responded not to authority or force, but to understanding and gentleness. It was a revelation in the silent room, a fragile hope that, for the first time, someone truly knew how to reach the child. The nurse stayed kneeling beside the cradle, watching the baby's furious cries fade into ragged gasps for air. She had tried everything familiar, everything standard, and nothing had worked. The infant's wails shook the walls, and yet she remained calm, her hands hovering lightly over the small body, her eyes fixed on the tiny, trembling form. Then, slowly, she shifted her approach. Instead of rocking, feeding, or speaking above a whisper, she simply held her hands near the baby, allowing warmth and presence to speak first. She exhaled slowly, matching the rhythm she wanted the child to follow, and whispered nothing at all, only a gentle, consistent hum, more felt than heard. The baby's cries did not stop immediately. They clawed at the air, piercing, frantic, and wild. But there was a subtle change, the slightest pause between shrieks, a brief stilling of tiny fists, a flicker of recognition in the wide, wary eyes. The nurse remained perfectly still, radiating patience and calm, never forcing, never pressing, simply allowing the infant to sense safety. Minutes stretched, each one heavy with tension, the room filled with anticipation. From the shadows, the Mafia boss leaned against the doorway, silent and unblinking. He had watched countless failures in his life. People falter under pressure, yet nothing had prepared him for this. His powerful presence, normally enough to command obedience, held no sway here. And now, witnessing the nurse, he saw something extraordinary. Compassion in action, an unspoken connection bridging fear and trust. The baby's wailing gradually softened, cries turning into small hiccups, then muffled coos. The tiny fists unclenched, the body relaxed, and a single drooping eyelid blinked up at the nurse. Relief and awe rippled across the room. Even the seasoned staff, used to control and discipline, stared, uncertain whether to celebrate or fear that such a fragile moment could exist in a house governed by power and intimidation. The nurse smiled softly, brushing the fine hair from the infant's face, her arms steady and warm. It was not a triumph of force or skill. It was patience, presence, and understanding. The Mafia boss remained frozen, stunned, a quiet awareness settling in. The smallest, most fragile life had just demonstrated a power far greater than any empire, and this poor nurse had just performed a miracle in silence. The Mafia boss stood in the shadows, his dark eyes fixed on the nurse and the baby, yet his mind was elsewhere, tangled in emotions he had long suppressed. For years, he had built walls of steel around himself, walls that had kept fear, weakness, and vulnerability far from his life. But now, watching a tiny human in his arms, helpless and trusting, he felt something entirely foreign, a deep, gnawing fear. Fear that he could lose this fragile life. Fear that no amount of power, money, or control could protect what he cherished most. Helplessness crept into him, a sensation he had never allowed. He was used to commanding men, orchestrating empires, and bending circumstances to his will. But here, in the quiet intensity of the nursery, he realized that nothing he had ever done mattered if his child's trust and safety were at stake. Each soft coo from the baby, each relaxed sigh in the nurse's arms, pierced through his hardened exterior, leaving him raw and unsettled. And then came love, pure, unfiltered, and terrifying in its intensity. The kind of love that demanded protection, patience, and sacrifice, none of which he had prepared for. He realized that all the threats he had ever faced, every rival, every betrayal, paled in comparison to the vulnerability of a life so small and dependent. As he watched the nurse, he saw more than her humility or her skill. He saw someone capable of understanding the child in ways he could not. Her patience, warmth, and intuition bridged a gap that he had thought unbridgeable. Suddenly, she was no longer just a servant in his household. She was a guide, a protector, someone who had earned a place in the most sacred, untouchable corner of his life. The realization unsettled him, humbled him, and awakened a part of his heart he had buried long ago, forcing him to confront what it truly meant to care for someone beyond himself. A sharp knock at the office door pulled the Mafia boss from his thoughts, and his eyes narrowed instantly. One of his lieutenants entered, face pale, urgency written in every line. "Boss, we've intercepted chatter. The rivals, they're planning something. They know the baby's here." The words hit him like ice water. He had faced countless threats before, ambushes, betrayals, assassination attempts, but never had a danger struck so close to something he truly cared about. His child, so small and defenseless, was at risk, and no amount of power or fear could shield the infant entirely. Panic gnawed at him, sharp and unrelenting. Meanwhile, in the nursery, the nurse sat calmly with the baby in her arms, completely aware of the tension creeping through the mansion, but showing no sign of fear. Her hands were steady, her voice soft and measured as she hummed a gentle tune, keeping the infant soothed despite the approaching danger. Her courage was quiet but absolute, a presence that radiated reassurance to the baby and, unexpectedly, to the boss himself. He paced the office, mind racing. Strategies, contingencies, escape routes, and security protocols all blurred together as his emotions warred with logic. He had to protect the baby without letting fear compromise his judgment. Every decision mattered. Every second was critical. Orders were barked to his most trusted men. Increase perimeter security, monitor all exits, ready the armored vehicles, and ensure no one outside the family could breach the mansion walls. And yet, despite the chaos, he couldn't take his eyes off the nursery. The sight of the nurse, calm and unwavering, holding his child safely, sparked a complicated mixture of relief, admiration, and trust. For the first time, he realized that courage wasn't always about strength or power. It could exist in the quiet patience of someone who understood what truly mattered, someone capable of facing fear without flinching. In that moment, both his instincts as a mafia boss and his heart as a parent converged, preparing him for whatever was coming. The mafia boss watched from the doorway as the nurse cradled the baby, her movements careful, deliberate, and gentle. For weeks, he had maintained a distance, observing, calculating, and controlling every interaction in the mansion. But now, something shifted within him. He realized that no command, no force, and no threat could replicate what this young woman was offering. A sense of safety, patience, and genuine care that the baby instinctively responded to. Slowly, cautiously, he allowed her to remain close, to guide the infant's fragile world without interference. At first, the staff exchanged uncertain glances. They had never seen their boss yield control in such a subtle but profound way. Yet, as days passed, the tension in the mansion began to ease, not because of fear or authority, but because of the atmosphere the nurse had created. Her humility, her quiet empathy, and her unwavering attention softened the cold edges of the household. Guards who had once stood rigid and tense now moved with less anxiety, careful not to disturb the calm that had begun to form around the baby. The infant, once a whirlwind of cries and flailing limbs, began to relax in her presence. Eyes that had always been wide with fear now followed her with curiosity, occasionally glancing up at the boss as if testing whether he, too, was trustworthy. Slowly, the cries became less frequent, replaced by soft coos, content sighs, and tiny, tentative smiles. Even the mafia boss felt the change ripple through him. The walls he had built around his heart, the armor of suspicion and control, softened under the quiet influence of the nurse. He began to see her not just as someone performing a duty, but as a bridge between his child and a world that had seemed too harsh, too dangerous, too cold. Their bond grew, unspoken yet undeniable, a connection forged in trust, respect, and shared concern for the baby's safety. The mansion, once filled with rigid order and fear, slowly transformed. Hallways that had echoed with commands now felt warmer, softer, guided by empathy rather than intimidation. And in the center of it all, the baby, cradled in the nurse's arms, experienced the first real sense of safety, love, and trust, a small miracle born of patience, courage, and the quiet power of understanding. A sudden, sharp cry cut through the mansion like a knife, more urgent and piercing than any the boss had heard before. The baby's tiny body shuddered violently, lips turning pale, and the nurse felt a jolt of alarm ripple through her chest. Something was wrong, an unexpected spasm, a sudden fever, or perhaps a choking fit. But whatever it was, the infant was in immediate danger. The usual calmness of the nursery evaporated in an instant, replaced by a raw, desperate tension. Without hesitation, the nurse sprang into action. Her hands moved with precision, checking the baby's airway, gently patting and soothing, all while remaining perfectly composed. She monitored every breath, every twitch, every flutter of eyelids, using the knowledge she had gained from years of working in underfunded hospitals, where lives depended on quick thinking and calm judgment. She adjusted the infant's position, ensured the blankets weren't restricting movement, and spoke in a low, rhythmic tone, coaxing the baby to respond. The Mafia boss, usually unshakable and commanding, stood frozen in the doorway. He had always associated courage with dominance, power, and intimidation, but what he saw before him now was entirely different. This young woman, humble and poor, faced the most vulnerable life in the world without fear, without hesitation, and without expectation of reward. Her courage was quiet but absolute, born of empathy and understanding rather than authority. Minutes stretched like hours, each second heavy with suspense. Slowly, the baby's spasm subsided, color returning to tiny lips, and a tentative cry transformed into soft coos. Relief flooded the room, yet it was tempered by awe. The boss's perception shifted, seeing loyalty and love in a way he had never known. He realized that true dedication was not enforced through fear or obligation. It was earned through trust, compassion, and courage in the face of helplessness. As the nurse held the baby close, rocking gently, the boss felt a profound change within himself. In that small, tense moment, he understood that protection and care were not just about power or wealth. They were about presence, attention, and the willingness to act selflessly. He knew, finally, that loyalty and love could be demonstrated through courage, humility, and an unwavering heart, forever altering how he viewed both people and the fragile life he had sworn to protect. The days that followed were unlike any the Mafia boss had ever known. He observed quietly from the shadows, initially out of caution, but gradually, he couldn't help noticing the profound effect the nurse had on his child. The baby, once a whirlwind of cries and flailing limbs, now rested in her arms with a soft, trusting gaze. Every small coo, every tentative grasp of her finger, revealed a depth of influence that no amount of wealth, power, or authority had ever achieved in the mansion. The boss felt something shift inside him, subtle at first, but growing steadily. He realized that the fear and control that had defined the household were no longer the strongest forces at play. Instead, patience, empathy, and quiet understanding were reshaping the space around him. The nurse's presence was like a balm, softening the edges of a home long defined by intimidation and obedience. Even the staff, who had long moved with rigid precision, began to relax, their anxiety easing under the calm environment the nurse had created. The boss, once unapproachable and stern, found himself drawn closer to his child. At first, it was small gestures, leaning over the cradle, brushing a stray lock of hair from the baby's forehead, or simply observing with softer eyes. Each interaction chipped away at the fortress he had built around his heart. He began to speak in lower tones, gentler commands, and sometimes, not at all, allowing the nurse and the baby to guide the moments. He noticed the baby's reactions to him, once tense and wary, now softening. For the first time, he understood that affection required more than presence. It required patience, trust, and emotional vulnerability. Slowly, he began to mirror the nurse's care, learning to hold his child with gentleness, speaking softly, and even smiling when the infant responded. The mansion itself seemed to breathe differently, Hallways that had echoed with rigid footsteps and hushed tension now carried a quiet warmth. Laughter, soft coos, and gentle hums filled spaces that had been silent for years. Through the nurse's influence and the baby's response, the boss began to understand the transformative power of love, patience, and trust, lessons that softened not only his heart, but the very walls of the home he had built around fear. The Mafia boss sat alone in his office that night, the city lights casting long shadows across the walls. The events of the past weeks played over in his mind. The endless cries, the nurse's unwavering patience, the miraculous calm that had finally settled over his child. For the first time, he understood something he had never allowed himself to feel fully: gratitude, respect, and a deep, personal indebtedness. This young woman, who had entered his world with nothing but humility and courage, had saved more than a child. She had touched his heart, revealing a capacity for care he had long buried beneath fear and authority. He made his decision quietly, without ceremony, yet with absolute certainty. The nurse would no longer be merely a servant in his household. She would be recognized, protected, and rewarded. Her role in the mansion, and in his life, would be elevated, a permanent acknowledgement of the love and patience that had bridged the gap between fear and trust. He ordered new quarters for her, better provisions, and the freedom to act without interference whenever the baby needed her. This was more than a gesture. It was a declaration that compassion, courage, and understanding could change lives, even in a world defined by power and intimidation. The next morning, he personally summoned the nurse. Her eyes widened as he spoke, the usual authority in his tone softened by a rare warmth. "You've done more than anyone could imagine," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "You've earned a place here, not just with the baby, but with us. Your courage and heart will never be forgotten." Tears welled in her eyes, but she bowed humbly, unable to fully express the gratitude and relief that surged within her. The baby, sensing the calm and safety, reached out for her, cooing softly. In that moment, the mansion, once a place of fear and power, had been irrevocably transformed. Love, patience, and selfless care had not only saved a life, they had rewritten the rules of an entire world, proving that even the smallest hearts could teach the strongest lessons.